Imagine a young Frenchman born in 1509, in the midst of a Europe brimming with new ideas and drastic changes in the Christian faith. This young man, named John Calvin, grew up in Noyon, a small town in northern France, in a family that dreamed of seeing him enter the Catholic clergy. His father, Gérard Cauvin, an influential ecclesiastical administrator, ensured that Calvin received a refined and rigorous education. From an early age, he demonstrated a sharp intellect and an exceptional talent for study. His future seemed promising within the Catholic Church, but God had other plans. In a world where papal authority was still dominant, Calvin's journey would lead him to break away from established traditions and become one of the most influential reformers in Christianity. As a young man, Calvin was sent to study in Paris, one of the great intellectual centers of the time. Initially, he pursued a legal career at his father's request, delving into the study of law and humanism, two fields that would profoundly shape his way of thinking. The influence of Renaissance humanists and his immense dedication to classical texts made him a meticulous and rational scholar. He was not a natural-born rebel, but rather a reserved and methodical intellectual, someone who sought to understand truth in its purest form. While many reformers of the time were marked by dramatic spiritual experiences, Calvin's conversion was more of a theological conviction than a mystical revelation. Something began to change in his mind and heart as he studied the scriptures more deeply. Around 1533, a defining moment transformed Calvin's life. He came into contact with the writings of Martin Luther and other reformers, and gradually his beliefs began to shift. The doctrine of justification by faith and the absolute authority of Scripture resonated deeply within his soul. In his own writings, Calvin described this conversion as a moment when God, by his grace, tamed his rebellious mind and led it into obedience. This spiritual awakening not only reshaped his understanding of the Christian faith, but also put him in danger. France was a staunchly Catholic country, and any sympathy for Protestantism could mean persecution. When his involvement with Reformation ideas became evident, he had to flee to save his own life. Exiled from his homeland, Calvin wandered across Europe, finding refuge in cities like Basel, where he connected with other reformers. It was during this period that he began writing his most famous work, Institutes of the Christian Religion, a systematic explanation of Reformed theology that would become the foundation of Calvinism. His writing style differed from Luther's, who often used passionate and confrontational language. Calvin, on the other hand, was methodical, logical, and deeply biblical. His goal was not just to challenge the Catholic Church, but to provide a complete theological framework for the new Protestant faith. His scholarship quickly attracted the attention of religious leaders, and he began to be recognized as one of the foremost thinkers of the Reformation. Despite his growing fame, Calvin was never a man who sought the spotlight. He avoided unnecessary disputes and preferred study and writing over public exposure. However, God had other plans. In an unexpected turn of events, Calvin was called to Geneva to help organize the city's Reformation. Initially reluctant, he accepted the mission, believing it to be a divine calling. Little did he know that this invitation would place him at the heart of one of the most revolutionary movements in Christianity. The young scholar and exiled Frenchman was about to become the architect of a new religious order, shaping not only Protestantism, but also the culture and politics of the nations that would embrace his reformed vision. If you made it this far, it means this content resonated with you. So don't forget to leave a like, as it helps this message reach even more people. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future content that can deepen your understanding of faith. Also, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below with your country or city so we can see how far this message is spreading. And of course, share this video with friends and family who need to hear about the powerful history of John Calvin and the Reformation. Your support makes all the difference. The Protestant Reformation was an explosive movement that shook the very foundations of European Christianity. At the center of this storm was Martin Luther, whose writings and teachings ignited a revolution against the authority of the Catholic Church. But Luther was not alone in this fight. His ideas rippled across the continent, influencing countless thinkers, among them John Calvin. Though they never met in person, Luther's bold stance against the papacy and his emphasis on salvation by faith alone deeply shaped Calvin's theological framework. Luther laid the groundwork, but Calvin took it further, refining and systematizing the ideas of the Reformation into a structured theological system. Yet, despite their shared commitment to reform, there were key theological differences that set them apart, differences that would define the future of Protestantism. One of the most notable divergences between Luther and Calvin was their understanding of the Lord's Supper. Luther rejected the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, but still maintained that Christ was physically present in the Eucharist, a concept known as consubstantiation. Calvin, however, took a different route. He believed that Christ's presence in the supper was spiritual, not physical. To him, the Eucharist was a means of grace, a way in which believers were spiritually nourished by Christ, rather than a literal ingestion of his body and blood. This theological nuance may seem minor, but it created deep divisions among Protestants, setting Lutheran and Reformed traditions on separate paths. Even today, these differences persist in various Protestant denominations. Another major theological distinction was predestination. Luther acknowledged the sovereignty of God in salvation, but was not as rigid or systematic about it as Calvin would later become. Calvin's doctrine of unconditional election stated that God, before the foundation of the world, had already chosen who would be saved and who would be condemned. For Calvin, salvation was entirely in God's hands, and human effort played no role in securing one's place in heaven. This belief became one of the cornerstones of Calvinism and distinguished his movement from Lutheranism, which left more room for human cooperation with divine grace. The doctrine of predestination was controversial even among Protestants, with some embracing it wholeheartedly and others rejecting it as too harsh. While Luther's Reformation was fueled by a defiant, rebellious spirit, Calvin sought a more structured, disciplined reform. Luther was a fiery preacher, a man of passion who often engaged in heated disputes with his opponents. Calvin, on the other hand, was a meticulous scholar, preferring deep theological reasoning over dramatic confrontations. His methodical approach attracted those who desired a more organized and systematic form of Protestantism. This difference in temperament was reflected in their movements. Lutheranism thrived in Germany and Scandinavia, while Calvinism spread throughout Switzerland, France, the Netherlands, and beyond. Calvin's structured approach to church governance also played a crucial role in shaping Protestant communities worldwide. Despite their theological disagreements, Calvin had great respect for Luther. He often referred to him as a pioneer, someone whom God had used to awaken the church from its spiritual slumber. However, the tensions between their followers would eventually lead to divisions within Protestantism, with Lutherans and Calvinists often clashing over doctrinal points. Yet, despite these differences, the core message remained the same: salvation by grace through faith, the authority of Scripture, and the rejection of papal supremacy. The impact of Luther's Reformation on Calvin cannot be overstated. Without Luther's boldness, there might not have been a Calvinist Reformation at all. But Calvin was not content with simply following Luther's lead. He had his own vision, one that would soon reshape Geneva and ultimately the entire Protestant world. By the early 1530s, John Calvin had become a marked man in Catholic France. His embrace of Reformation ideals made him a target of persecution, forcing him to flee in search of safety. His journey took him across Europe, but it was in Geneva, Switzerland, that his destiny truly unfolded. At the time, Geneva was undergoing its own religious upheaval. struggling between Catholicism and the rising influence of Protestant reformers. In 1536, Calvin, planning only to pass through the city, was unexpectedly drawn into its religious reformation. William Farel, a fiery preacher and reformer, saw in Calvin the intellect and leadership Geneva needed. Farel implored Calvin to stay, even going so far as to threaten him with divine judgment if he refused. Reluctantly, Calvin agreed, but he would soon realize that reforming Geneva would not be an easy task. Calvin's initial years in Geneva were filled with conflict and resistance. The city was not ready for his rigorous vision of a disciplined Christian community. He and Farel attempted to implement strict moral and doctrinal reforms, enforcing church discipline and establishing a code of conduct based on biblical principles. This included regulations on church attendance, personal behavior, and even restrictions on entertainment. However, Geneva's city council found these measures too extreme, and in 1538, both Calvin and Farel were expelled from the city. Rejected and humiliated, Calvin left, believing he had failed in his mission. He settled in Strasbourg, where he continued his theological work, refining his ideas on church governance and doctrine. But Geneva had not seen the last of him. In 1541, Geneva called Calvin back, recognizing that his leadership was essential for the stability of the city's reformation. This time, he returned not as an outsider, but as the city's theological architect. He implemented a new church structure based on his vision of a reformed theocracy, where the church and state worked together under divine law. The consistory, a governing body composed of pastors and elders, was established to oversee both spiritual and moral matters. This system enforced discipline within the church, ensuring that Geneva's citizens adhered to the moral and doctrinal standards Calvin had set. Those who resisted, whether through public drunkenness, gambling, or spreading false doctrine, could face severe consequences. Under Calvin's leadership, Geneva became a model of Protestant order, admired by some and feared by others. Central to Calvin's reforms was his most influential work, Institutes of the Christian Religion. Originally published in 1536 but expanded over the years, this theological masterpiece laid out a systematic and logical framework for Protestant theology. Unlike Luther, who wrote in a more polemical and passionate tone, Calvin's writing was structured, precise, and deeply intellectual. His work provided a foundation not just for Geneva, but for the entire Reformed tradition, influencing churches across Europe and beyond. Geneva itself became a training ground for Protestant leaders. Exiled Protestants from France, England, Scotland, and the Netherlands flocked to the city, learning from Calvin and taking his teachings back to their own countries. Through Geneva, Calvinism began to spread like wildfire. By the time of his later years, Calvin had transformed Geneva into a beacon of Protestantism. The city was no longer just another Reformation stronghold. It had become a center of theological education and religious discipline. However, his rule was not without controversy. Critics accused him of being too strict, too authoritarian, and his involvement in the execution of heretic Michael Servetus in 1553 cast a shadow over his legacy. Yet, despite the controversies, his impact was undeniable. Geneva had become the heart of the Reformed movement, and Calvin's influence was now reaching far beyond its borders. His disciplined, structured approach to Protestantism would shape entire nations and religious traditions for centuries to come. At the heart of Calvin's legacy lies his theological system, one that would shape the course of Protestantism for centuries. While Martin Luther had ignited the flames of the Reformation, Calvin meticulously structured its doctrines into a cohesive and disciplined framework. His teachings, often summarized under the 5 points of Calvinism, Tulip, offered a rigorous and systematic view of God's sovereignty, human salvation, and the role of the Church. These doctrines, though controversial, became the foundation of Reformed theology, influencing countless denominations worldwide. Whether embraced or debated, Calvin's theology forced believers to wrestle with the profound mysteries of divine grace and human responsibility. The most defining and debated of Calvin's doctrines was predestination, the belief that God, in his absolute sovereignty, had chosen before the foundation of the world who would be saved and who would not. This was not based on human merit, works, or free will, but purely on God's divine will and purpose. This concept, known as unconditional election, emphasized that salvation was entirely an act of God's grace, with no room for human effort in determining one's eternal fate. For many, this doctrine was both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because it highlighted God's absolute control and faithfulness, but unsettling because it raised difficult questions about human free will and divine justice. Critics argued that such a belief made evangelism and personal faith meaningless, but for Calvin, it was the ultimate expression of God's sovereignty. Another key pillar of Calvinism was total depravity, the idea that humanity, due to original sin, was completely fallen and incapable of choosing God on its own. Unlike some theological traditions that held that people still retained some ability to seek God, Calvin taught that every aspect of human nature was corrupted by sin. This meant that without divine intervention, no one could turn to God on their own. Salvation, therefore, was not a matter of human decision, but of God awakening the spiritually dead. This belief reinforced the necessity of irresistible grace, the idea that when God chooses to save someone, that person cannot resist his call. This was not a forceful compulsion, but rather a transformation of the heart, where the sinner was drawn to God by an inward, irresistible grace. Calvin's theological vision also extended into church discipline and governance. Unlike Luther, who allowed for more individual freedom in matters of worship and personal conduct, Calvin emphasized a strict, disciplined Christian life. He believed that the church was not just a place for worship, but a divine institution meant to shape and govern society. In Geneva, this took the form of moral laws, church oversight, and strict punishments for those who strayed from biblical principles. Calvin saw discipline as a necessary tool to preserve the purity of the church and prevent moral decay. While some saw this as a form of spiritual oppression, Calvin and his followers believed it was essential to maintaining a society that honored God. Beyond doctrine and church discipline, Calvinism also had a profound influence on economic and social ethics. One of Calvin's most unexpected but lasting impacts was on the development of capitalism. His teachings on hard work, diligence, and financial stewardship laid the groundwork for what later became known as the Protestant work ethic. He taught that work was a calling from God, and success in one's labor was a sign of divine blessing, not in the sense of earning salvation, but as evidence of God's providence. This mindset encouraged economic productivity, frugality, and personal responsibility, shaping the culture of nations such as the Netherlands, Scotland, and even the United States. Whether intentional or not, Calvin's doctrines helped shape not just religion, but the very fabric of modern society. Despite its influence, Calvinism was far from universally accepted. From the moment John Calvin's teachings began to spread, they faced intense criticism and opposition, not only from the Catholic Church but also from other Protestant reformers who found his doctrines too rigid and uncompromising. The very ideas that made Calvinism powerful, its structured theology, strict moral discipline, and emphasis on predestination, also made it controversial. Some saw it as the purest expression of biblical truth, while others viewed it as a cold, harsh system that left little room for human freedom and grace. Throughout history, Calvinism would be challenged, debated, and even rejected by those who found its implications troubling. One of the fiercest criticisms of Calvin was that his theological system made God seem unjust and unloving. Many opponents, both Catholic and Protestant, questioned how a just and merciful God could predestine some people to salvation while condemning others without giving them a chance. The doctrine of double predestination, the idea that God not only chose the saved, but also actively predestined the damned, was particularly disturbing to many. Critics argued that this made God appear arbitrary, stripping humans of free will and responsibility. While Calvin maintained that God's justice was beyond human comprehension, many theologians, including those within the Reformed tradition, struggled with the implications of his teachings. Some later softened Calvin's doctrine, seeking to balance divine sovereignty with human responsibility. One of the most controversial events tied to Calvin's leadership was the execution of Michael Servetus in 1553. Servetus, a Spanish physician and theologian, denied the doctrine of the Trinity and rejected infant baptism, both of which were considered heretical by Protestants and Catholics alike. When he arrived in Geneva, he was arrested, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake. Though Calvin did not personally carry out the execution, he supported the verdict, believing that heresy was a crime against God and the Church. This event cast a long shadow over Calvin's legacy, with critics labeling him a theocratic dictator. Even some Protestant reformers, including Sebastian Castellio, condemned the execution, arguing that Calvin had betrayed the very principles of religious freedom that the Reformation sought to promote. Beyond theological disputes, Calvinism also led to deep divisions among Protestants. While Luther and Calvin agreed on many fundamental doctrines, their differences created two separate Protestant traditions that often clash. Lutherans rejected Calvin's rigid predestination, while Calvinists saw Lutherans as lacking theological consistency. In the 17th century, this division became even more pronounced with the rise of Arminianism, a movement that directly opposed Calvin's teachings on predestination. Jacobus Arminius, a Dutch theologian, argued that God's grace was available to all people and human free will played a role in accepting salvation. This led to the Synod of Dort, 1618 to 1619, where Calvinist leaders condemned Arminianism as heresy and reinforced the 5 points of Calvinism. Even today, the divide between Calvinists and Arminians remains one of the most debated topics in Christian theology. Despite these conflicts, Calvinism endured, but not without adaptation. Over time, some branches of Reformed theology softened certain aspects of Calvin's teachings, particularly in relation to predestination and church discipline. Puritans in England, Presbyterians in Scotland, and Huguenots in France all embraced Calvinism, but applied it in unique ways. Some maintained strict church governance, while others emphasized individual piety and personal religious experience. While the core principles of God's sovereignty, the authority of Scripture, and disciplined Christian living remained intact, Calvinism evolved, responding to the criticisms and challenges it faced. Whether loved or hated, Calvin's theological system had left an irreversible mark on Protestant history, one that would continue to shape Christian thought for generations. John Calvin's influence did not end in Geneva. In fact, his teachings spread far beyond Switzerland, shaping the religious, political, and economic structures of entire nations. Unlike Lutheranism, which remained mostly confined to Germany and Scandinavia, Calvinism became a truly international movement, adapting to different cultures and political landscapes. From France to Scotland, from the Netherlands to the American colonies, Calvinist thought transformed societies, fueling revolutions, shaping governments, and even influencing capitalism. Calvin's structured theology and disciplined church governance provided a blueprint for Protestant communities seeking independence from centralized religious and political authorities. One of C. The first places where Calvinism took root was France, where its followers became known as the Huguenots. Despite facing brutal persecution from the Catholic monarchy, the Huguenots established thriving communities, influencing French politics and culture. However, they were constantly at odds with the Catholic majority, leading to bloody conflicts like the French Wars of Religion, 1562-1598, and the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, 1572, where thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered. Eventually, many were forced to flee to other countries, bringing Calvinist ideas to places like England, the Netherlands, and even North America. Though they never gained dominance in France, the Huguenots played a key role in spreading Calvinist principles across the Western world. In Scotland, Calvinism found a powerful advocate in John Knox, a fiery preacher who had studied under Calvin in Geneva. Knox brought the Reformed faith back to Scotland and played a pivotal role in establishing Presbyterianism as the national church. Unlike the Anglican Church of England, which retained a hierarchical structure with bishops and royal oversight, Presbyterianism was based on Calvin's idea of church governance through elected elders, presbyters. This not only shaped Scottish religious life, but also laid the foundation for democratic principles, as church leadership was based on collective decision-making rather than monarchical authority. Presbyterianism would later spread to Ireland, Canada, the United States, and beyond, continuing to influence Protestant communities worldwide. Perhaps one of the most remarkable examples of Calvinism's global impact was its role in shaping the Dutch Republic. In the late 16th century, the Netherlands fought for independence from Catholic Spain, and Calvinism became a rallying force for the Dutch resistance. The Dutch reformed. Church emerged as the dominant faith, and Calvinist ideas of hard work, discipline, and divine providence helped shape Dutch society, economics, and governance. The Dutch Republic became one of the most prosperous and tolerant nations of the time, leading in commerce, banking, and global trade. Many historians argue that Calvinism played a direct role in the development of modern capitalism, as it emphasized economic responsibility, frugality, and the moral value of work. Across the Atlantic, Calvinist thought had a profound influence on the American colonies, particularly among the Puritans and the Pilgrims. Seeking religious freedom, Calvinist settlers established communities in New England where they applied Reformed principles to both church and civil governance. Concepts such as a covenant-based society, self-governance, and moral discipline were central to Puritan life, deeply shaping American political ideals. Many of the founding fathers of the United States were influenced by Calvinist thought, particularly its emphasis on constitutional government and checks on absolute power. Even today, traces of Calvinism can be found in American religious and political culture, particularly within evangelical and Reformed traditions. Calvinism's global reach is undeniable. It has shaped governments, economies, and religious traditions across Europe, North America, and beyond. While its rigid doctrines sparked controversy and division, its emphasis on discipline, education, and hard work left a lasting mark on the world. Whether in the democratic structures of Presbyterianism, the economic ethics of Dutch Calvinists, or the political principles of early America, Calvin's legacy extends far beyond theology. What started as a religious movement in Geneva became a driving force in shaping the modern world. John Calvin was not just a theologian, he was an architect of modern Protestantism, shaping not only religious doctrine, but also social structures, political thought, and economic practices. His teachings gave rise to a disciplined, structured faith, one that emphasized God's sovereignty, the authority of Scripture, and the importance of moral order. Through Geneva, Calvinism spread across the world, influencing nations, revolutions, and even economic systems. Whether admired or criticized, Calvin's impact cannot be ignored. His doctrine of predestination sparked centuries of theological debate, forcing believers to grapple with the tension between divine sovereignty and human responsibility. His model of church governance influenced the development of Presbyterianism and Reformed churches, emphasizing collective leadership rather than hierarchical rule. His vision of a disciplined Christian society shaped nations, particularly in Scotland, the Netherlands, and America, where Calvinist ideas helped shape democratic institutions and work ethics. Yet Calvin's legacy is also complex. His strict enforcement of religious discipline in Geneva, including the execution of Michael Servetus, remains one of the most controversial aspects of his life. His theological rigidity led to divisions among Protestants, particularly between Calvinists and Arminians, a debate that continues to this day. Some view Calvinism as a cold, deterministic system, while others see it as a powerful affirmation of God's absolute control and faithfulness. But perhaps the greatest measure of Calvin's influence is the endurance of his teachings. More than 500 years later, his ideas continue to shape churches, inspire theological debates, and influence global Christianity. So, as we reflect on Calvin's role in the Reformation, here's a question for you. Was Luther the fire that sparked the Reformation, or was Calvin the one who structured and sustained it? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this journey through history insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video so more people can explore these deep theological truths.